Most people think that their biggest rental decision is about the type of house that they should rent. Others, they feel it is about how much they should pay for the certain accommodation that they are going to get. And for some, it is about the location, like where the house is situated. But let me ask you, for you, what do you consider to be your biggest rental decision? Welcome to the Property Hustle. And today's episode may help you to avoid one of the biggest financial mistakes that a lot of tenants make. For a lot of people, when it's time to rent an accommodation, they go for inspection, they inspect everything, inspect the house, the floor, the window, the toilet, and all the things. In fact, some people even go as far as inspecting the landlord, right? And the truth of it is to inspect all those things, to do all those inspections, they are very, very important. But there's one very, very important inspection that a lot of tenants they miss out, which is the inspection of self. You know, the first house, the first inspection that you should do before anything is the inspection of you, is the inspection of yourself. Because once you miss that inspection, no matter how beautiful the house is, it doesn't matter whether the house is beautiful, it doesn't matter whether the neighborhood is fine, is beautiful, is a posh kind of neighborhood. It doesn't even matter whether the house is very, very cheap, right? At the end of the day, you might just end up at the wrong part or wrong side of your decision. You might just end up making the wrong decision. You understand? In one of your biggest, or should I say your biggest rental decision. And let me ask you again, what is your biggest rental decision? What do you consider to be your biggest rental decision? To me, I think the biggest rental decision is not really about all those where you stay and all that. I think your biggest rental decision is about whether you'll be able to renew that rent, in the next 12 months. It's not about the payments that you make now. It's not about the location. It's not even about, how much the accommodation costs. I think your biggest rental decision that you take is whether in the next 12 months you'll be able to renew the accommodation. Because, getting that key, paying that first money, getting the first key is very, very exciting. But keeping that key, is where the challenge really begins. I've always maintained that, Nigeria's rental market is having a lot of issues, a lot of real issues. And that at the end of the day, it frustrates everybody. The landlords, they are complaining, the tenants, they are complaining, the agents, they are complaining, and even the government, they are complaining of probably their inability to provide affordable housing for the masses. So I understand that all those things, all those subjects, all those concerns are very, very valid and they are very, very important. But and I know for sure that all those ones they need reset, right? Right? They need kind of a re-engineering, a reset. But beyond that, I think as a people we also need a reset in our thinking, in the way we think. Because for most of the conflicts and the misunderstanding and the problems that you have between landlords and tenants, it's not problems that starts today. It's not problem that comes during the time of rent renewal. There are problems that has been there. There are problems that started way before the first payment for the rent is paid. You understand? There are problems that came as a result of we getting into renting an accommodation without truly deciding whether we have the financial capacity to be able to maintain and to renew the accommodation, even with our current financial strength, right? And surprisingly, for a lot of people, they think that if by chance, maybe somehow, they are able to make that first payment, pay that first rent, that all the problems, all their housing problems is solved. And I think that is not really the truth. I think, in fact, that is even one of the biggest misconception in rental, renting, because the hardest the hardest rent to pay is not that first one. It's the second rent, maybe the third, maybe the fourth, but it's not the first one. So, having that first rent to pay does not solve all the problem. Now, come to think about it. Before you pay that first rent, before you got to that level to make that first payment, you must have taken months, years, planning, putting resources together, making all the necessary sacrifices, in fact, preparing your mind for that day. And once that day comes, that time comes, and you've now made that payment for the first rent. What matters at that point in time is no longer about anything. It's just about, okay, how do I move into this house? It has to now do at that point with, the excitement that comes with knowing that finally you now have your own space, that finally you now have your freedom. And at that point, it's very easy to just relax and say, okay, at this point, I'll worry about the next rent later. But now, what happens next year when the reality, strike, when life returns back to normal, when the school fees, returns, when you now have this need to take care of hospital bills, to take care of family needs, when the family need is not even waiting for you, when the inflation, let's say keep rising, when let's say they've increased the fuel cost, right? And the cost of accommodation is increasing and all that. Will you be able to still make the payment? Will you be able to be financially set to make the payment for the next 12 months, even with your current financial strength? That is the real inspection. I've noticed something over the years, that most of the problems we blame landlord, for, that when there's a problem between landlord and the tenant that we blame landlord for, they are not problems that just start today, right? They are not problem that is probably even related to the landlord. Now imagine somebody wants to rent an accommodation, and he uses all his money to rent the accommodation. Sometimes some persons, they even go as far as borrowing money just because they like that particular house, just because maybe they like that particular location, just because maybe for some emotional, some reasons, maybe their wife likes the location if it's a man, right? Just emotionally, they just go the extreme length and just collect the accommodation. And for sure, for the next few months, everything is fine and all of that. But suddenly, the reality strike, right? To renew the rent now becomes stress. It becomes a lot of problem. Everybody now becomes so frustrated, right? It now becomes a lot of pressure on you, the tenant, to renew that rent. The landlord is already having problem in his mind, thinking you are not even taking the payment of the rent or the renewal of the rent seriously. That is no longer an option for you. It's not part of your main concern. And then that relationship between the tenant and the landlord, between you and the landlord, begins to deteriorate at that point in time. And so most of the time, it is not even about the fact that maybe the landlord, they've increased the rent. You understand? The problem, that misunderstanding, it starts from when the tenant decides to even rent an accommodation without thinking of giving that breathing room to their finances. You understand? And so I would like to suggest that the next time you are renting an accommodation, or before you rent any accommodation, before you make the payment, that you should carry out what I call the rent renewal test, right? And this test, I'm not saying you carry out that test maybe next month or maybe after you've made the payment. No, you're not carrying it out in the next 11 months. No, you carry out that test like right now before you make the payment, right? And this rent renewal test, it contains like 5 questions, which I called the 5 C's. The first C of that 5 C's of the rent renewal test, take note, there are 5 C's. The first C is capacity. The first question you ask yourself before you make a payment for any accommodation is, you ask yourself, will I still have the capacity to make this payment next year, considering or imagining that my income level is the same, my salary is the same, my business is still going to be generating the same amount of money without any addition, no anything. Will you be able to make that payment? Will you be able to renew the rent the next 12 months if nothing changes? That is the first question. It's very, very important, because your rent renewal is not coming in the next 12 months, right? It's starting immediately after the first one has been paid. And so the next question that you ask, you understand, in this test, in these 5 C's, is cash flow, right? So you ask yourself, will you still be, liquid? Will you still be very okay to survive after you've made the payment, this first payment, right? Will you still be able to eat food and feed your family? Will you be able to take care of the family emergencies, medicals, and all the things that you have to take care of, the transport? Will you be able to survive after the first payment is made? And that is where it becomes very, very important that when paying the rent, it doesn't get to be emotional. Because if you now pack all the money you have in this world because you like that particular accommodation and you now make the payment, what happens tomorrow? Will you be able to feed, or your house is going to just turn to like a chaos, right? Will you be able to survive Is there anything? Is there how you are going to survive? So the second question, just like I said, is about the cash flow. Will you still be liquid? Will you still have cash to survive for the next 12 months and going after you've made the first payment? So it's very, very important. And then the third C, the third question that you should ask is commitment, because it is not just about making the payment, this first payment, and which is why you see that a lot of time making that first payment, for a lot of people, they just find a way and all of that. It's very, very easy. But now the question is, will you be able to make that commitment to start preparing for the next rent after the first payment has been made? Will you? So that is the third question, is commitment. Will you have that commitment? Because like I said, the next rent is not starting, is not coming the next 12 months, it's not coming the next 11 months. It's coming like after you've made this first payment, because that is where the real thing is. Will you have that commitment? So that is the third question that you ask. And then the fourth question you ask is, will you have that consistency? Will you be consistent in making these preparations? So for instance, will you be able to save like every month towards the next year's payment? You understand? It's not like you are going to make this payment, this savings or whatnot, when it is convenient. No, that's not consistency. Consistency means you are doing it even if it's not favoring you, even if it's not convenient for you. So will you be able to dedicate yourself or commit yourself that every month you are maybe saving maybe 1/12 of your accommodation cost for the next 12 months? Because that is what separates from a tenant who maybe a few months to the time of rent begins to panic, and somebody who is just living his life comfortably, and the time of rent comes and he pays and maintains a very good relationship with the landlord. So will you have that consistency? That is the fourth question. Now the last question in these 5 C's is contingency. Do you understand? So now, as you are making this payment for the first time now, right, you are thinking about a whole lot of stuff. You are thinking about the renewal, which is very, very important. Now you also need to now think about, as part of that thought towards the renewal, of, will I have the contingency? Have I put enough contingency arrangement in place? What is your plan if anything happens? Because life happens, things happen. Somebody could fall sick, you could lose your job if you are an employed person. Your business can have a problem, your business could fold. There could be some natural disaster. So what is a contingency plan? How are you going to do if any of these natural occurrences happen? So before you rent any accommodation, these questions are very, very critical. That these questions are asked. Will you have those things? Ask the 5 questions. Right? Now, if you look at this recap, let's even look at these 5 questions now. If you look at it very critically, you see that something interesting is happening here. Out of all these 5 questions, the capacity, the cash flow, the commitment, consistency, contingency, out of these 5 questions, you notice something. That there's none of these questions that is about the landlord. There's none of these questions that is about the house. There's none of these questions that is about the location where the house is situated. There's none of them that is even about the cost of the accommodation or how much the house costs. All these questions is about the tenant. It's about you. And now you see that it's now clear that the first inspection, right, that you do, the first thing that you check is yourself. The first inspection that you do before you rent any accommodation is yourself. You inspect yourself. Will you have the capacity to, live in this house comfortably, peacefully, and still maintain good relationship with the landlord? Because at the end of the day, it's also good to identify or to acknowledge the fact that the person that built a house has tried. So these questions are very, very critical questions, and you see that they are all about you. So the first thing is you. That's the first inspection. That is a real inspection. You need to check whether you are going to be able to renew the rent. You understand? Because at the end of the day, it is very clear that there is a statistic that said 1 out of 3 landlords in Nigeria, they have problem with their tenants. And this problem that they have is related to rent renewal, right? To rent payment, rent renewal. 1 out of 3. That means if you are looking at on a scale of 100, you are having like 33%, I think 33% of landlords, they're having problem with their tenants on the basis of their inability to renew their rents. And so if more landlords are having this problem, right, and other ones that are coming up to become landlords are seeing this problem, it discourages. You understand? And so if we begin to try to link it to, my previous episode about affordable housing, you now realize that that is a problem that is coming, because it discourages more people from coming into, building rental accommodation. And so the housing deficit gap that we're talking about, it keeps expanding. It keeps expanding. And that is where the real problem lies. So if this conversation today, this episode today, if it interests you, if it changed, somehow it changed the way you think about rental, even if it's just a bit, please share it with your family, your friends, your connection, anybody you know. Share it with anybody, with the next person that wants to rent an accommodation, with that friend, that family member, that brother, that sister that you have that wants to go and rent an accommodation right now, or is about to make that payment. Tell him to stop. Tell him to just wait a little. Share this information with him. That maybe it can help him to make, or help her to make, a better decision. And then I'll leave you with one question, right? I'll leave you with one very small, simple question. Out of these 5 C's in this my rent renewal test that I talked about, the capacity, the cash flow, the commitment, the consistency, the contingency. Out of these 5, which of the C do you think most tenants they omit when they are trying to rent an accommodation? Please drop your answer in the comment. Let's continue the conversation in the comment section. And I'll see you on the next one. Thank you.